I'm curious, Wendy, you were diplomatic about the difference between bilateral and regional negotiations. From the standpoint of the United States, I tend to think that the abandonment of TPP, while it may not be, it may not rise to the level of a Brexit failure, I think it was a very significant blow to us. So talk a little bit, you've got an overall Asia perspective. Put our Japan negotiations in the context of what we're trying or should be trying to do regionally and how it's affecting us.
Well, I mean, that's a good question, and it's hard to answer given that the administration is focused on pursuing a bilateral approach with countries on trade right now. You know, it's very interesting. Early on, when we first started discussing TPP with Japan, this was before Prime Minister Abe became the Prime Minister, and the opposition party at that time was the DPJ. And we'd have had a number of meetings with DPJ politicians and ministers during those years. And they were interested, or some of them were interested in pursuing a bilateral FTA with us at that time, and they didn't want to join the TPP. And one of the reasons why they were skittish about joining the TPP was that because there were so many other agriculture-focused countries in the agreement, like Australia and like New Zealand, and they thought that if they could pursue a bilateral FTA, it might be easier for them with respect to the agriculture sector. And at that point, the administration was hell-bent we were going to do a regional approach because that made sense. That was the way trade was being conducted, given supply chains in the region. It was much more impactful to negotiate a deal with many countries. And I also think what this administration, I think, is beginning to appreciate now, you only need one congressional vote if you bring a regional deal home. So in the TPP itself, you had a U.S.-Japan bilateral FTA, you had an updated NAFTA, you had a U.S.-Vietnam bilateral FTA, et cetera, and all of this could have just been accomplished with one vote. We can debate whether that vote was going, to happen or not happen, or would have been positive or not. But at that time, and to this day, I'll run into some of these DPJ politicians, and they'll remind me how I lectured them about how we could not do a bilateral FTA, that was out of the cards. And now, that's what we're pursuing. And, frankly, that's the administration's prerogative. What I would just hope is that given, and I think Chris really touched on this, there's so many other trade issues and other economic issues and other non-economic issues that we should be working closely with Japan on. In the trade arena, for example, we should be working with them to reform the WTO, to address a number of China's problematic practices. We should be working on standards of the technologies of the future, and I can go on and on. And so I would really counsel the administration to look at what we've already agreed to with Japan, figure out what they really need in a negotiation, and try and put forward reasonable requests to Japan, because I think Japan would like this negotiation to go smoothly and quickly. And so I think there's a real potential for that. And what I would hate to see is someone who's spent many years of my career really trying to advance this economic and trade relationship. I would hate to see this negotiation kind of turn into a friction-full negotiation. Look, any negotiation's not easy, I get that, and you're not going to put on the table, your bottom line in the beginning. But I would just hope, given how much the U.S. and Japan have gone through on the trade front, and how much important work there is for the future for both countries to lead on and work on together, that we both sides would find a way to kind of navigate through this deal to make it, not this heavy lift that goes on and on and on, but, that both sides are kind of practical and really looking at the bigger picture.
Chris, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, let me make an additional point to that, which is actually right on. One of the concerning aspects of the lead into or the lead up to the beginning of this negotiation is the the lack of clarity as to what is going to be negotiated and when. If you look at the joint statement that the President and Prime Minister issued in September, it's pretty clear that agricultural products and automobiles were respectively high on the minds of Prime Minister Abe, or President Trump rather, and Prime Minister Abe in that order. And the text of that statement fully reflects the positions as laid out. The agricultural issue is an extremely serious one and pressing one for American farmers today, given that they now operate at a severe price disadvantage relative to exporters who are in TPP or in the EU exporting to Japan. And that clearly is something that needs to be resolved as quickly as possible. There's a lot of political pressure, I think, here in Washington on political leaders on the Hill that we've been talking to, as well as in the administration. And everybody, I think, understands that. There is clearly also, as Wendy and Dan were noting, a very high degree of concern in Japan about the possibility that they'll be hit with auto tariffs and a desire to see that threat removed or resolved somehow. But beyond those two, and in theory, both of those problems could be solved without an agreement. But if that's the way things went in this negotiation, we would, as Wendy is noting, miss the opportunity to address a wide variety of other issues, some of which are also quite pressing. One of those is U.S. healthcare products, pharmaceuticals, and medical devices exported to Japan. As a result of some of these more open policies in Japan that have incentivized the kinds of innovative treatments that actually the aging population in Japan needs, the Japanese government in recent years had been actually the fastest to approve new drug treatments in the developed world, faster than the U.S. But the fiscal challenge of funding that single-payer national healthcare system has mounted, and the government over the last 2.5, 3 years has started to unilaterally cut prices for which drugs and we expect eventually medical devices are being reimbursed. This is going to have a direct impact on U.S. exports to Japan, because U.S. and international companies occupy fully 20% of the Japanese pharmaceutical market and 25% of the medical devices market. So you're going to see those figures showing up shortly. And unless we can work on a more holistic approach than simply whacking away at drug prices, Japan not only will not be able to solve its healthcare problem, but U.S. trade frictions are going to grow worse over that issue. Beyond that, we have the opportunity to try to harmonize standards in a wide variety of other areas, as well as remove some of the lingering non-tariff trade barriers that are still out there in certain industries. And finally, we could work with the Japanese to alter some other regulations that will have pro-business effects and increase trade between the U.S. countries without a lot of cost to either of them. So there's a lot of opportunity here. So what we would like to see certainly is some of these pressing issues, whether it's autos or ag or pharmaceuticals, solved as quickly as possible. But then we want to make sure that this negotiation goes on and is comprehensive in nature and addresses all the other opportunities we have out there.
Dan, you wanted to add?
Yeah, just very quickly. One thing I think to keep in mind is that the broader this negotiation, the longer it's going to take. And of course, there's been talk about this sort of a two-stage process by Lighthizer and others, where you do sort of get some quick early wins, ideally in things that would not require congressional approval. But as the U.S. pushes for a far broader negotiation, you're talking about a far longer process. And let's keep in mind that, we've got the 2020 elections are already upon us. That makes things more difficult. But simply the fact that it'll be interesting to see when Motegi and Lighthizer get together and sort of define the parameters of this, how that plays out, and the extent to which this is a really broad sort of negotiation, which the Japanese are not too eager to engage in, at least initially, versus a more constrained one where there can be some quick things that Trump can point to as victories. And of course, I mean, driving this is his fixation on trade deficits and right now it's getting any victories he can possibly claim.
Well, it is a challenge, though, for the reasons that all of you have said. Excuse me. Frankly, once a negotiation is moving forward, it becomes the vehicle for various industries to bring up their concerns, and the train gets moving, and it may be the only opportunity you have to talk seriously about these things. From my standpoint, it's always been, if I look at the overall trade landscape, any president elected in 2016 would have been looking for a tougher trade policy toward China, which doesn't necessarily tell you what that would be. And evidently, we had to reevaluate NAFTA and modernize it, and certainly the administration is trying to do that, and Ambassador Lighthizer is trying to come forward with the USMCA. Wendy, I'm wondering, at what point do we get into a bandwidth problem for USTR? I mean, how much trade negotiating and how much time getting the USMCA through Congress, how much can Ambassador Lighthizer and the team do?
Okay, well, first I have to say that no one works harder than the folks at USTR. You can push them, they don't need a lot of sleep, and they can work around the clock. So let me just get that on the table. That said, I think it's quite interesting that technically, given the TPA procedures, the administration, as of the end of January, was legally entitled to start negotiations with Japan. However, we're now in April, and it looks like the negotiations will start in a couple of weeks. And I think part of the reason here, let's be honest, is that Ambassador Lighthizer has been very busy, and rightfully so, negotiating with China. I think what we're seeing in this administration, a lot of these negotiations are really done at the senior levels, and the career people seem to have less authority and not the kind of mandate than they did have in previous administrations. That might change over time, but right now, I think it's really key for the Japan talks that Lighthizer and Motegi, they need to meet, they need to set the parameters, and then hopefully they can shift some of the actual work to the negotiators. And I know the negotiators on both sides very well, and the teams. Both sides are incredibly equipped to do this, and very professional. And so maybe we'll see that happen. Just one thing I do want to put on the table here that hasn't come up. When I look at this negotiation, and I think Dan raised this thing of phases, there is some talk in town of kind of this mini deal where perhaps Japan is asked to basically move on agriculture along the lines of TPP and the EU deal, maybe a little more. And in return, the U.S. reaches an accommodation with Japan on Section 232 auto tariffs, either through a quota with growth or some other accommodation. And I would just put on the table, as someone who's worked with Japan for many years, I don't think a deal like that where the United States doesn't make tariff cuts will really work for Japan, particularly given that Japan will need to bring this treaty to the Diet. And I can hear in the back of my head something I've been lectured on through my whole career by the Japanese, the issue of unequal treaties. And we've heard actually the unequal treaty issue also come up a few weeks ago by one of the senior Chinese negotiators. In other words, I think a red line for Japan in the negotiation would be moving unilaterally on cutting its tariffs and quotas on agriculture, bringing that to the diet without the United States making any corresponding tariff cuts on industrial or agricultural goods. I think that would be very politically difficult, if not impossible, for Prime Minister Abe to pull off in the diet. So I wanted to put that on the table, because that is something that in this town you're hearing more and more about, you know, a mini deal.
No, I know I've been wondering, both with Japan and the European Union, whether there was a point at which the aggressive policy and sort of the demands, and particularly in the auto sector, could become a point at which, you know, each side, the other side would say no at some point. Now, you know, we'll see. I mean, Japan has a great commitment to the United States, and they live in a tough neighborhood, so the security relationship with the U.S. has always been of paramount importance. I'm looking at my watch and thinking we ought to take some questions from the floor.
Thanks, Ira. We're going to have a mic runner go around. Ask folks to please identify yourselves, your name, your affiliation, and to try to keep your questions short, please.
Jim Fothery with GR Group Asia. Thanks all for a really excellent discussion. Wendy, quick question to your last point. Do you see any way that the administration would give up on the 232? Because in some ways, whether it's imaginary or not, it's been used and perceived as leverage by the administration over anything. And we've not yet given up the 232 with Canada and Mexico. And so this quid pro quo skinny deal with Japan moving on ag and we giving up the 232, do you see that as a possibility? And then secondly, primarily for you, but for any others, Japan's been really clear about things that they'd be willing to do, not only on tariffs that are in line with the TPP, but the new U.S. standard is the USMCA. Are there ways that if we were thinking optimistically and proactively like you and Dan and Chris are, in terms of future-oriented industries, are there any incentives that we could provide to get Japan to move further along in things like digital trade?
It's hard for me to see the administration just dropping the 232. I think they view it as something, as long as it's in the background of these negotiations, it gives them leverage. I guess the question would be, what would be the accommodation on autos that could be reached? You know, according to my statistics, and I know Charles Youthis will go into this more, I believe about 2/3 of sales of Japanese cars are from plants in the United States. And so, you know, the landscape has changed dramatically since, you know, we negotiated autos over, you know, many agreements over the past years. And so, you know, one thing some of my Japanese friends will tell me, you know, we will never do a quota. And I respond by saying, well, you said you would never do a bilateral. So my view is, I think a lot of our trading partners, initially they say never, but they have come around under threats from this administration. And, you know, my view on a quota vis-a-vis Japan, that maybe at the end of the day, like as in the case of Canada and Mexico, if there was sufficient growth built into a quota, you know, that may be an accommodation, you know, that Japan wouldn't love, but maybe they could live with. But once again, what I don't think they can live with is bringing a treaty to the diet with just unilateral tariff cuts without the United States cutting some of its agricultural and industrial tariffs. And that's a big problem for the administration, because let's keep in mind that the minute the U.S. cuts tariffs, that means they need a congressional vote. And, you know, that's kind of the bottom line in my view right now in this negotiation. So it'll be very interesting to see what at least the initial opening salvos are by the United States vis-a-vis Japan in this negotiation.
Dan, you wanted to add?
Well, I actually just wanted to sort of reiterate what Wendy talked about. I think if you compare the difference between a 232 tariff action versus quotas, I've heard from some Japanese friends that if, as Wendy said, the quota allowed room for growth, that might be acceptable compared to the alternative. So that may be something that provides an out on this. Because if in fact there were tariffs imposed by tariff man, as the president calls himself, that is a case on autos. I think that's a case where the Japanese would very likely feel they had to respond in some way, as opposed to steel and aluminum.
In terms of incentives for Japan, in addition perhaps to finding some way out of the 232 impasse, I think for Japan, the opportunity is there in two senses to have an agreement that will be very positively perceived. The more narrow one is by focusing again on some of these future opportunities being developed by technology. Japan, as a government, is trying to move away from its traditional attachment to large wads of cash and try to get the populace in general to move to electronic payments. And in order to do that, they're going to have to introduce a wide variety of new technologies, not all of which have been fully proven. And all of those are going to rely on having the most advanced regimes around the control, the security, and the cybersecurity of data. And data is increasingly becoming critical not only to high-tech industries, but obviously to every industry where data is becoming increasingly the driver for opportunities for growth and further development of products. And that's true whether you're making a combine or you're making a digital game. So getting the rules around data harmonized between the US and Japan will create a lot of opportunities, not only for US companies, but also for Japanese companies. And you're seeing in Japan more and more young people moving, much as they have been here, into creating startups, introducing new forms of digital and other commerce. That's really the growth opportunity for the future in Japan. And again, I think this agreement has creates an opportunity to set some very high-level standards, and based on those standards, then the businesses from both countries will be better able to compete and introduce what will be successful products for the future.
I think that was a good question and some good answers, but we won't get too many questions at that rate. So let's try, we'll shorten it up a little.
Merely International Trade Today. I wanted to ask what y'all are hearing from your Japanese contacts on how important it is for them to get the steel tariffs lifted through these negotiations, and if that dropping of tariff on our side would be seen as a good counterbalance to them giving the ag market access. And Wendy, you were saying you were hoping we wouldn't have unreasonable demands. Are you concerned that Lighthizer is going to take a page from the 80s and ask for voluntary export restrictions, or what kind of unreasonable demands are you fearing?
Well, first, it's interesting. With respect to the steel tariffs, Japan was pretty quiet in its response, and unlike other countries, it did not counter-retaliate.
Right.
Japan provides a lot of kind of the high-niche steel to our markets, and this hasn't been, a big issue for them. So I don't see that as really being it'd be helpful, and Japan would welcome that if those tariffs were lifted, but I don't see that then, leading them to make, big concessions. What was the second question?
What kind of unreasonable demands are
Oh,
we concerned
unreasonable
about?
demands, okay. Well, okay, let me put my hat on, having sat through a lot of these negotiations. One would be if the United States went forward and asked for a lot more on agriculture than we achieved in TPP. And let me just be honest about the TPP agriculture deal. I mean, it wasn't perfect, right? And we didn't go to 0 tariffs on all the products. At the end of the day, the beef tariff goes to 9%. And, the same, pork goes down to like 50 yen and, et cetera, et cetera. There is kind of an understanding in the September joint statement between the United States and Japan that the U.S. would respect Japan's wish to kind of keep agriculture at the TPP levels. But I think if the United States came forward and asked for a lot more on dairy or rice or beef or pork, I think Japan would view that as unreasonable. I also think, for example, asking for a quota, or you can call it a VRA or an OMA or whatever, but some kind of quota on auto and auto parts, which was not only did include growth, but let's say was less than current trade. So those are just two examples that come to the top to the top of my head.
Hi, Brock Williams with the Congressional Research Service. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the logistics from the Japanese side of doing this kind of skinny deal where they unilaterally lowered their tariffs to something like the TPP on ag without the U.S. doing something reciprocally. Would there be WTO implications for that? And do you think that would be a concern for Japan?